Good morning. It's now 2:23 here on the East Coast. Russia reacting strongly to the U.S. missile strikes against Syria. Kremlin saying the aggression against a sovereign state is in violation of international law. Joining us now on the phone is Michael Singh, Senior Fellow and Managing Director at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. What do you think about what's happening there right now, the latest there with Kremlin?
Well, you know, I think that the strike by the United States seems to have a pretty clear and narrow purpose, and that was to respond to those chemical weapons attacks by the Assad regime in Khan Sheikhoun, and to impose a cost for those attacks. I think that in itself will shape the reaction of other states. I think many states will welcome that. Obviously, we're seeing protests from Russia, and this will make Secretary of State Tillerson's trip to Russia next week obviously an interesting visit, but it may also ultimately limit the amount of criticism or the sort of level of the reaction of the Russians, because it was apparently a pretty narrowly targeted and one-off sort of strike.
Do you think Secretary Tillerson, that is, will continue to go there on Wednesday, or do you think this will be canceled?
It's of course possible that it could be canceled, but you know, I would suspect that there's sort of more reason for it now than there ever was before, because this does raise the question of what is American strategy in Syria, what is sort of Russia's reaction to what the U.S. is doing, and there's really more call now for this kind of deliberation. It's of course possible that Russians could cancel it and protest, but there really is a clear need for it, so hopefully it'll go forward.
Now, this chemical attack happened on Monday, and it did not take long for President Trump to react to that. And people have been saying, as we know, President Trump has a soft spot for children. And, you know, really everyone, I think, can have a soft spot when they see those images. I know we have some of them, and it's almost, you know, you hate to show those images because they're so graphic and so hard to look at. But it's something that we need to see. It's a reality there in Syria. And unfortunately, this is not the first time this has happened. This Syrian civil war has been going on for 6 years. It started in 2011. And from there, we have seen the UN saying that Syria, the Syrian government, has had a chemical attack 3 times now there on the civilians, and 1 chemical attack by ISIS. Something's got to change. And those are the images that I'm talking about. They're just heart-wrenching.
Well, it is terrible. Obviously, there's many, many terrible things that have happened in Syria. This is a conflict that's claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, displaced millions of people. And I think one could argue, and many of us have argued, that the United States and the international community should have taken much firmer action earlier. I think that this action by the United States, obviously, it's in reaction to a very terrible attack, but it also serves, I think, a more sort of geopolitical purpose as well, in a sense. It's to reinforce what had been a taboo against the use of chemical weapons. You know, that's something that I think successive governments have tried to uphold and has really sort of diminished a bit over the course of this Syrian conflict, because chemical weapons have been used with relative impunity. So it may accomplish that to some extent. It may require further strikes in the future to really firm that up. What it won't do, though, to be clear, is end the suffering in Syria. That would really require a much broader strategy, maybe much more involvement. And I think the big question mark that still hangs over this is, what is the larger strategy here? Is this part of a larger strategy, or is this really simply a one-off?
You know, back in 2014, I believe that's when it was, Syria was told by the UN they had to get rid of all of their stockpile of any chemical weapons that they had. And at that point, it was told that they did. But there were some people in Syria coming back and saying, hey, listen, they didn't get rid of everything. They still have stuff there. And this is what we're seeing today. What could we have done differently? At what point would you have said we should have stepped in, this starting back in 2011?
Well, I think that when President Obama laid down that red line in 2012 about the use of chemical weapons, and when that red line was crossed by the Assad regime, President Obama's threat to use force really should have been carried through quickly and decisively. And I think that's in some ways what shapes President Trump's action today, is this sense that our deterrent was weakened by that sort of hesitation in the face of the sort of crossing of the red line by President Assad. So in a sense, I think had we acted more firmly then, perhaps there wouldn't be this need to act now. Many people would say, I would say, that in fact, that sort of intervention diplomatically to go in and send inspectors to remove chemical weapons, number one, it wasn't successful, obviously. And number two, it arguably shored up the Assad regime and threw them a lifeline when it looked like they were in a pretty sort of tight spot. So, I think that acting decisively in these cases, acting swiftly so that there's a clear connection to the transgression that you're responding to is important.
I think that's one thing people really love about President Trump is he makes that decision and he follows through with it. It's also something that scares people greatly. What are some of the repercussions we could have here in the U.S. because of this missile strike? 59 missiles hitting the Syrian government, military there, and those missiles are told to be about 1,000 pounds each missile, so that's about 59,000 pounds of missiles there. What could be the repercussions for us?
Well, I think it's worth saying up front that one of the encouraging things about this episode, whether you ultimately agree with the objective or the action or not, is that it seems to have been relatively carefully thought through. The way that the National Security Advisor, General McMaster, described the process was one where they were considering different options. They were asking, in a sense, the right questions, and it was a methodical process. I think that's encouraging because there have been a lot of questions about what kind of processes would the Trump administration follow. And it seems like there was a pretty deliberate effort to minimize civilian casualties, and so far from initial reports, there were very few of those, to certainly ensure there were no Russian casualties, and we have no reports of those so far. And so some of the repercussions we might have worried about, for example, the possible Russian casualties or sort of maybe striking the chemical weapons stores and things like that. It doesn't look like those things actually happened because it does look like a good deal of care was put into this. So certainly you still worry about what will Russia's reaction be. Will Syria and Russia and Iran now interfere with our efforts against ISIS? But I think that those have been minimized in a sense by the way this was carried out.
All right, Michael Singh live on the phone this morning. We appreciate you being here with us.